three crosses. Three crosses stood grimly side by side on the hill of Calvary. On each a suffering man had died, two for their crimes, the other for me. Like a lamb they let him out to die from the shades of Gethsemane. He uttered no moan, no bitter cry. It was love that moved him to die for me.
And so on it goes. This is a very beautiful song, right? All right, so I mean, very beautiful poem. I don't know about the song. But anyway, so I just made it a simple little minor chord thing like this. Three crosses stood grimly side by side on the hill of Calvary. On each a suffering man had died, two for their crimes, the other for me. Something like that. Okay. Let's try it. And Stephanie, yeah, you'll punch a little twanger for me. All right. That's easy enough, right? It's a simple kind of tune, right? Let's try it. Three crosses stood grimly side by side on the hill of Calvary. On each a suffering man had died, two for their crimes, the other for me. Like a lamb they led him out to die from the shades of Gethsemane. He uttered no moan, no bitter cry. Was love that moved him to die for me. On the central cross they nailed my friend to anguish and agony. He bore it all to the bitter end. Oh, wonderful love, he died for me. If thou art the Christ, they taunting said, come down from the cursed tree. He heeded no jeering word they said, but bowing his head, he died for me. Like a wandering sheep, I had gone astray, but all my iniquity, my God laid on him that awful day, when bearing my sins, he died for me. Yeah, I didn't put verses 6, 7 down yet. This is I don't know if you remember last time. Anybody remember what song we did last time? Go to Dark Gethsemane. And the first verse was so touching, like Gethsemane. And the first verse of this also is three crosses, and the first, and then somehow the writer gets a little bit away from the theme. I would have liked to have had a dialogue with the bad thief and a dialogue with the good thief and everything like that. But that's something for Leandro to put together and do as a solo for us some night. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. And let's turn to Luke 23. I'm glad you all studied this in a pod. There's so much in there. Is that going to blow on me like that, or am I going to move? I think I'm going to move. You know, just give me this thing. I'll cover that. I should do it. All right. So we're coming right to the end of the Gospel of Luke. And it would be good to remember that Luke had no intention for the thing to end in chapter 24, because he went right on and wrote approximately the same time the book of Acts. The first gospel, the book of Luke, is the stories about the things Jesus began to do and teach, as Luke says in his intro to Acts, which implies that the book of Acts is very wonderful as a written record of the things Jesus continued to do and teach among his assembly, named the church in the book of Acts. So it's very wonderful. But we are coming to the end of the Gospel of Luke. And I pray that you and I have gotten something out of it. It's very, very precious, very unique angles that Luke gives us of this familiar gospel story. All right, you know what? I think maybe we should read just right at the end of the chapter, actually, on his crucifixion and all. And then we're going to take it up sort of section by section, because otherwise we just do a lot of reading and perhaps don't remember the things we've read. Why don't we just read beginning in verse 32 to the end of chapter 23. So beginning verse 32. And Sarah, you got it.
Yeah. 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the skull, they were crucified. There they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by, watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews.
Okay.
Sorry, Tim.
Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, If you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, Do not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation. And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our sins. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
Jesus answered him, I tell you the truth. Today you'll be with me in paradise. It was now about the 6th hour. Darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. For the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he had said this, he breathed his last.
Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised to God, saying, Certainly this man was innocent. And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the woman who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things.
And behold, a man named Joseph, who was a counselor, a good man and just. And this man had not ascended to their council, and they of Arimathea, a city of Jews, who also waiting himself also for the kingdom of God.
This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid it in a tomb cut in stone, where no one had ever yet been laid. It was a day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to his command.
All right, so let me just read you something here. At the very beginning of the gospel, Luke makes it clear that he is trying to compile a record of the facts of Jesus' life. And so you'll see that's the background of what happens in chapter 23 and why he brings forth so many witnesses and things. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. So original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed these down to Luke. He compiled them as he was led by the Spirit and presented Jesus in this very wonderful and human way, right? I mean, I think you all can see now that Luke so much is fascinated with Jesus, who is the Son of God and divine, but the particular, as he looks at the diamond of who Jesus is, the humanity of his character has been that which has touched this physician to the very core of salvation. So tonight we look at the trial and crucifixion, and I'm just give a little background from the other things we studied, because of course this is the moment. This is the divine human moment. This is the center of all of the four Gospels when Jesus died on the cross. The way Luke gathers the information, it's obvious that the plans have been made in heaven and are brought to their climax now. It's also only in Luke that Jesus says that now is the hour and the power of darkness. So in the kingdom time zone, as it were, certainly for the disciples, they'd come into this hour of darkness where it appeared that the enemy had the upper hand. And Jesus was swept away from the disciples and falsely accused. The whole thing was a work of darkness. But Jesus acknowledging in chapter 22, I think it was, right? That now 23. Now the hour of darkness has come. Jesus acknowledged that the Lord has allowed this dark phase to come into as part of his salvation plan, hidden in the mystery. And so we see now at the end of chapter 23 that a cast of minor players appear in this redemption story, redemption play, all somehow drawn into the life of the Son of Man. There's something about the very title Son of Man. Now, you know, this is a very pregnant title for the Jews and in the Bible, because first of all, Son of Man means just a man. Sometimes in the Bible, it just means man. You know, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou carest for him? Now, that's not saying what is man that you care for him, and then Jesus. It just is another way of saying man. A Son of Man is a way of saying man. But it also is a title of messiahship that the Jews, that the prophets spoke of, and the Jews understood was the name. One of the titles for the Messiah. He'd be called the Son of Man, right? But there's a third way Son of Man is used, like in Psalm 8, that very section, what is man thou art mindful of him? Because Son of Man sometimes is used as man as he was meant to be in God's eternal purpose, not just fallen man as we know ourselves to be, but man the way Adam was created and the way Jesus lived. What is a man? In other words, it's kind of implying, what's a real man according to God? It's the Son of Man. So Jesus comes and he has all three of these aspects in his life. He was very human. He was the Messiah. And he was what man's supposed to be. And Luke wants us to see as a derivative of the gospel story what we are supposed to be as men of God now born again. See? So this is all about Jesus. And so this theme is very important. Jesus has been made perfect by the things that he suffered. Is that in the Bible? Don't say it, Ray. Where is it? We are now seeing the culmination of Jesus' perfection. It's interesting, isn't it, that Jesus was sinless, but not perfect. Because, see, sinlessness is not perfection. Just because you're sinless doesn't mean you're perfect. Jesus not only was sinless, but he was perfect because he finished doing God's purpose for his life. So let's just say we decide to all become monks and nuns and hang out in the wilderness so we never sin again, and somehow we were made sinless, although that'd be very hard to do with you guys around. We'd start fighting each other for sure. But let's just say we remain sinless. But now we're out in the desert not fulfilling God's purpose. We'll never be perfected. So Jesus had to be perfected in this process of suffering, ultimately his death on the cross. But according to the book of Hebrews, which is where that's from, according to the book of Hebrews, he suffered a long time before his actual death, just living in this world. He was perfected and he learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Okay. So when we see this in terms of Luke chapter 23, we see him as a very human being. We see him weeping, praying the cup of passion, sweating, praying as a man, and then settle on the matter as man in the nobility of man's free will. Now, see, the Son of Man has free will. And Jesus, for all the torment of knowing the cost of what he was going to go, he could still decide, Father, not my will, but thine be done. He was indeed a man perfected in the midst of temptation, trial, and all. And then when we see him facing his enemy, whether it's in the garden or in the court, his royal composure and his quiet spiritual authority were born in silence, healing, and truth-piercing brevity. You know, through this whole thing, he just said a few words, but they were like daggers. You know, he just say a few words, but they were so full of truth. He didn't have to jabber on. His opponents were totally unprepared and frustrated by the serenity of their victim as he went as a lamb to the slaughter. You know, they got no satisfaction. So after it was all over and the mob had their way, they went home and beat their chests. They were never so unsatisfied, looking for somebody, seeking revenge, looking for somebody to unveil their anger and spit at the people or do they see that? That's what they wanted to see, a real show. They got no show from Jesus. Right? Now, Luke in chapter 23 has these three evident goals in mind, and we will just notice it as we go on. He wants to show repeatedly that Jesus was innocent of the charges made against him. Now, it's very important for a citizen, a Grecian citizen. Don't forget, he's writing to Theophilus, a Greek citizen of Roman descent. The Romans knew about the Roman law and everything, and he wants to make it clear just by giving the facts so everybody could see Jesus was not guilty of sin. He did not do something wrong. He was charged without substance. Number two, they brought forward witnesses outside of the disciples and the inner group with Jesus to verify that he actually died and then was buried even in a known location. Luke's very careful to chronicle that in his own way. And three, he presents these facts to the reader so there could be no shadow of a doubt that the Son of Man and the Messiah really died. There's such a pregnant pause in the Greek at the end of 23, and so they rested. And suddenly 24. And on the first day of the week, now, but it's not that Jesus fainted. It's not that Jesus, had a heart-stopping experience and he was on the operating table for a half hour and he went up to heaven and came back. He died, and he was buried in a grave. And this is so important for the gospel. Luke wants to square that in his details. So we saw the first stages of the pretrial travesty of justice, which happened the night before, that is late Thursday night and into Friday morning. And of course, actually, it is illegal in Jewish law to have such a court at night, but it wasn't really a court trial. It was actually gathering information. So first they brought him before Annas. That's Caiaphas' father-in-law. Annas is really the head honcho. He's really in charge. And they bring him to Annas. Annas asks him questions. And in the end, Jesus is slapped for his insolence before a great man of God like Annas in all his robes, finery, and wealth. And then in the dark of night, he's sent to Caiaphas, and probably it's in the same palace, just in another section. And so Caiaphas, the active high priest, the younger son-in-law, brings the lawyers together, trying to trump up charges. They have this charge, that charge. Well, we saw Jesus doing this. We saw Jesus say he would destroy the temple, but they couldn't find corroborating witnesses. And then only about daybreak did they start talking to Jesus. And when they asked him, and who are you? Are you the Son of God? And he said, you say so. And that's all they needed. They told Caiaphas put on that show of just destroyed him. He tore his garment. And then he went down to Macy's and got another one. But now blasphemy was the ground. But now you see, here's the point. You have to have grounds for the Romans to kill somebody. And the Jews were no longer allowed to kill somebody because they'd already killed too many people for various trumped up charges. So the Romans came in there and they disallowed the Jews to kill somebody. So the Jews had to make their case why he should be killed. And blasphemy wasn't really quite enough. So anyway, so the whole thing continues. And as we see from tonight in verse 22, he actually was tried 3 times by Pontius Pilate, right? The first time they bring him early in the morning before a groggy Pontius Pilate who'd been drinking the night before. Pontius Pilate lived a total life of leisure except when the Jews kicked up a storm. And that's why any time there was a feast season like the Passover, the leaders and the soldiers, everybody just wanted this thing to get over with and the people would go home. This was too crowded. Jerusalem, they say, had 1.5 million people at the height of the season. And if you've seen the little area of the old Jerusalem, you pack that many people in there, it's like packing them into Times Square. So Pilate listened to their accusations, insurrection, this and that. And finally, he says, well, are you king of the Jews? And the implication in the direction of the language seems to be that he's saying that as a jab at these Sanhedrin lawyers and scribes. We're standing there trying to accuse Jesus, and he's saying, and he's looking at this ragged guy who's been beat up, and scratched up, and tattered clothes, and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Maybe looking at these leaders, because one thing we know from history, even Josephus's history of Pilate, is he hated the Jews. He despised them. They were impossible to get along with or satisfy. He could never satisfy the Jewish, no matter what they did. This thing of handing over one guy a year and a total pardon thing, which now the President of the United States does one, just before he leaves office, he pardons a bunch of rascals. But this is seen as a merciful act, and it was all the way back in Pilate's day. But the Jews were never satisfied, no matter what you did. So Pilate basically said, "I see nothing wrong with him. I see no charges that you're making that have any substance to them whatsoever, and I'm going to release him." And so he says he's not guilty, and he states his conclusions. He sees Jesus' innocence, obviously. Now, we don't hear the story that we hear in John, which is during this first trial, what happens? What does John tell us? Well, yeah. But so in the first interview that Pilate has with him, he takes him into an inner court where he and Pilate have a short conversation, and it's about, "Are you the king of the kingdom?" He says, "My kingdom was of this world. My soldiers will be fighting, but my kingdom's not of this world." And the whole matter of what is truth came up, So anyway, but with all of that, now he comes out and he releases him. Now, Luke wants the readers to understand that Pilate's sense of Roman justice was a good Roman man. But when the Jews persisted and he found out that Jesus was from Galilee, then he said, "Oh, I'm going to send you to Herod." You remember that. So now the king of the Jews meets the king of the Jews. That's the irony of this moment. And in this moment, Jesus opens not his mouth and won't play any games and won't do any tricks like a pet dog for Herod, who was so reprobate. He had no conscience at all. He was a wicked man in every possible way. But he was also superstitious. And he wanted to see Jesus do some miracles. And so he kept asking Jesus questions. Jesus wouldn't talk. Kept asking him questions. You read the record. He kept talking. Jesus wouldn't say it. Then finally, bemused, maybe irritated, he gave him over to the soldiers who beat him around. And finally, they put this fancy robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. But as Pilate says in the second trial, Herod hasn't found anything wrong with him either. Right? So Luke gives Herod's response as further evidence of Jesus' innocence. In Pilate's trial number 2, now we come to chapter 23, 13 through 21. So now we should read that. Okay, where did we get to? Who was the last reader here? Jack. Okay, look, you got a Bible? Oh. Yeah, so we're going to read now. Yeah, Jason, go ahead. And then we'll pick up the next row behind us. So Luke 23, 13. Let's just do 13 through 17, this one part.
Pilate then called together the chief priests and their rulers and the people, and said to them, You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of the charges against him. Neither did Herod, when he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him.
Okay. So basically, Pilate once again sees what Herod has done. Once again, he judges that Jesus is not. Notice now this time his sentence is he is not innocent. I mean, he's not guilty of anything worthy of death. But if you want, I'll whip him and let him go. That much I'll do for you guys just to get you out of here, right? But the chief priests and elders have gathered a crowd of people together. I don't know how they did it. And this whole thing of Barabbas comes up. And crowds have been gathered to shout for Barabbas's release. And so, in an ironic way, the Son of Man dies in the place of a guilty, worthless, sinful man. And Barabbas is yet another incident in this travesty of Jesus' trial that we're trying to hear about. Okay, 17 through 21. Somebody read that. Loka?
17. Oh, some manuscripts have. Okay. Now he was obliged to release one man to them at the feast. With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown in prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!"
It's amazing. You want to release Barabbas back into society? So Barabbas was not like a worthless nobody. He was a revolutionary, and maybe a revolutionary leader. According to tradition, one of the church fathers, they say that Barabbas' actual name was Jesus Barabbas. And so it was Jesus Barabbas or Jesus of Nazareth. And you'll see that'll come up in the next conversation right here. 22 through 25. Bria.
And he said to them the third time, Why evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who their rebellion and murder had been put in prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will.
So Pilate again, trial number 3. You notice at the beginning of verse 22, Luke makes his record clear that this is the third time before Pilate, who is the one who has to give adjudication in this. Pilate says, I find nothing wrong with this guy. But the crowd begins to change his mind because Pilate's sense of jurisprudence is overridden by his greater sense of Pax Romana. Pax Romana is a new cosmetic. What is it, Bria?
It's the peace that the Romans kept.
And when you're one of these prelates of Rome, you're sent to keep the peace. So now they're about to stir up a riot over Jesus. So A, I want justice. B, I want peace and quiet. And so it's interesting how it says literally, I'm not sure it came out quite in that translation, that Pilate released Barabbas and gave Jesus over to the will of the people. That's quite a amazing statement there, isn't it? And of course, again, it's left out what is spoken of with much more detail. The other Gospels have much more detail. Before Pilate did this, what did he do?
Wash his hands.
He washed his hands in front of the people and said, his blood be upon you. And they said, yes, may his blood be upon us. There we are. So it was expedient for Jesus to die to keep the peace during the Passover as far as Pilate was concerned. All right, now verses 26 through 31, we come upon some followers of Jesus, some sympathetic with Jesus, and now they're affected by the cross. Everyone's touched by the cross. As the Son of Man is going to Calvary and dying on the cross, all mankind is represented in this picture. Which one are you? Are you Barabbas? Are you the daughters of Jerusalem? Let's read these verses. Ray, why don't you do this one here?
Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon the Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And a great multitude of people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. Jesus turned to them and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts which never nursed. And they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. If they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry?
All right. So here's a person, another witness, another person involved, because when the Son of Man dies, all men are brought into the scene. And Simon Cyrene, now who is he? What do we know about him? Well, we know he's from Cyrene. That's a good start. So that probably means he was African, black African. Number two, either he was a Jewish worshiper there for the Passover, which is very likely, or he may have just been a servant class people because, believe it or not, even back in ancient days, black people were often servants brought up from Africa. So either he was just a servant who was pressed into this. This is the Roman law, which allows soldiers to impress citizens or whoever they want to carry a load or do something to help out in the military. And so he was commanded to take Jesus' cross. So this says a couple of things to us. One, that though Jesus stood with nobility through all of this trial that he went through and even all of the physical abuse, that obviously his body was losing its power under all the hours of fasting and all that was going on. And so he probably started stumbling as he went down the Via Dolorosa. If you've been to Jerusalem, they've got the actual pathway. They say Jesus went, and at a certain point, he just stumbled and fell. And the Roman soldiers forced this guy, Simon of Cyrene. And of course, whether he was a Jew there to worship, whether he was a servant, of course, the wonderful thing that we know now is, having held up Jesus' cross, he became a believer. And according to Mark, we know his sons. You know his sons? Alexander and Rufus. So when Mark tells the story, he says, and certain Simon of Cyrene, who the father of Alexander and Rufus, because we all know he's in the fellowship. So the Jerusalem people know about him, but of course we haven't met Alexander and Rufus, although if Ray has too many more kids, those names will probably come up. All right, so we meet Simon of Cyrene. Now, having Rufus sounds good, doesn't it? And he'll be a roofer. So, so I hope you see the scene as Luke is trying to present it. Here's a man pressed into this story. He becomes a believer. Now, here's some women, sincerely crying, pious women, full of pity, daughters of Jerusalem, crying for Jesus and for what they're seeing and whatever of the scars and whatever of his agony, and they're crying for him. And he makes this strange prophetic statement. He says, don't cry for me. Cry for your own children. Now, why does he make this kind of statement?
We know that women who were bearing children during 70 AD, not only were eating them, but it was a bad scene.
Yeah. So what Jesus is basically saying, you got to hook this up, and that's why the sequence is sort of important the way Luke puts it. And it's like this. They said, give us Barabbas, crucify him, crucify him. Jesus says, because of what they have done, because of the rejection of the Jews, your children are going to come into such terrible times. You're going to tell a woman, bless her to you that you have no children, etc. And then he makes that statement. What do you think about this statement? If the tree is green now, what will it be when it's dry? What do you think? Eli, you got a good spin on that? You got a message coming up to the surface? Tian, what do you think? Well, the idea is this. I mean, let's say it's an olive tree, but the example is known back in ancient days, not so well now. And if things are going to come, if things have come to this and this crucifixion and this terrible stuff, while the tree is still green, there's still life here in Judaism and Jerusalem and everything. What are things going to be like when the tree is dry? And probably the Romans will come. Nothing will be spared. They'll be burning. And so right now, even with Jesus' death, the tree was still green, but soon the tree will be dry. Just a saying. So now these women are brought into the vortex of Jesus going to the cross. And so you see, if we put it this way, Because Jesus, the Son of Man, died on the cross, we all suffer. We all suffer because of the injustice of this whole thing. It's just, yeah.
Whenever it's on verse 28, so there's like the most recent fulfillment of it in 70 AD, but then what about in terms of like the figures?
Well, I think, once again, you have near prophecy fulfillment and further prophecy fulfillment, and the Jews have had a tough time ever since their rejection of Jesus. There's some Christians who try to push that too far, and they even, I wouldn't say they justify the Holocaust and things like that, but they say, according to the Bible, this is the time of Jacob's trouble. And it stems because of that rejection of Jesus, of their Messiah. And so this is retribution. So I think that's valid. Sure. Let's see. Okay, now we've skipped around. Priscilla, are we back to you now? Verses 32 through 34.
Two others also, who were criminals, were being led away to be put to death with him. When they came to a place called the Skull, where they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. But Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots, dividing up the garments among themselves.
Okay, so now here, to me, the thing is so stark. This is it. This is all it says about Jesus on the cross, right here. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him. That's it. Doesn't mention nailing his hands, doesn't mention. Again, Luke is more concerned with what's going on around Jesus, see what's happening among the people there. So he just mentions this reality, doesn't embellish it, and he gives the name of the place was called Golgotha, but he doesn't mention that that's the place name. He translates it for the sake of the Gentiles, just as the place of the skull, which has, again, a sort of a foreboding sense to it. So now, once again, Luke is trying to give some historical place names, and these things actually happened. It wasn't just Jesus dying on the cross; it was Jesus on the cross, and there's two thieves on either side. He's painting this picture for Theophilus and those fellow readers that would follow. And this, of course, is a picture of the place that today many people think is the place of the skull. If you look with enough imagination, and if you've been there, and if you don't look at the buses immediately below, it's a place that many people say, well, that certainly is a reasonable place. I just read today, G. Campbell Morgan said, I believe that's the place. So he thinks Gordon's Calvary, the place of the skull, were the real historical spot. But there you go. That's G. Campbell Morgan. Then verses 35 through 37. Roxanne.
The people stood by the front, and even the rulers were scared at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if this is the place of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself.
Okay. So Jesus is on the cross, and we hear one of three things that he says in Luke. Now, there's 7 sayings altogether, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in Luke, he only gives 3. And this is the first one, and only Luke gives it. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, I don't know who you think he's applying that to, but it looks to me like he's looking out over all of humanity, the whole world at the foot of the cross. There are some there who are yelling at him, jeering at him. There's leaders who are now such big shots. Now that Jesus is nailed up on the cross, they say, yeah, hey, if you're such a big shot, come on down. Yeah, they got him all tied up there, And boy, if Jesus moved and flinched, they would have fallen backwards. But little people are big shots when they gain control. There's nothing worse than somebody, you're trying to go through customs or something, you find some, I don't know why people find these positions where they're going to push people around, because they can. Anyway, so there's gamblers, there's mockers, there's jeerers, there's soldiers. Yeah, come on down. As if you're so great. You know, they're getting drunk. They're watching the scene. It's like going to a hanging down in Texas back in the old days. You know, it's just one of those terrible things. And in the midst of that whole thing, I mean, is this the greatest man that ever lived or what? They can look at man, even doing this to him, and say, Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing. And of course, he was absolutely right. These people had no idea what they were doing. And so much of the sin, even, you know, I used to get a lot more miffed when I heard people cursing and everything, using God's name in vain and everything. And I realize now, after so long a period of time, people have no idea what they're saying, what they're doing. You know, people are in darkness. They're just trying to be proud about something, you know. So you just have to sort of picture this kind of mob, if you can picture. Once again, this is one of Tissot's wonderful paintings. It's been sketched up and colorized a little bit. And the people are jeering and yelling and pushing. It's a big day there in Jerusalem, and they're watching this big occasion. And Jesus is above it all, right? Father, forgive them. Wonderful. 39 through 43. These are the two thieves on the cross now. Lorene?
Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, If you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, Do not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation. We indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, Assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise.
Now here Luke uses a most unlikely witness to the innocence of Jesus in this man hanging to his left or right on the cross. Evidently, Lorene, you didn't read that. I don't know if it's in verse 39 or 38 where it says, and there was an inscription above his head saying, this is King of the Jews. Anyway, it seems like that inscription caused this one thief in his agony to look and see the inscription, Jesus, King of the Jews, and it caused this man to begin to launch into Jesus and tell him if he's really King of the Jews, come on, save us and save yourself and all of this kind of thing. And actually, the other gospel record says that both men had been taunting Jesus in their pain. And then once again, when somebody is carrying on like that and they're in such great pain, how many of you recognize when people are in great pain, they don't know what they're saying? Don't take what people say at face value when they're in great pain. They say something against you, don't get it into your heart. When people are in great pain, they're just yelling. Right? Very important to know that, because you'll see it happening even among your loved ones. Okay. Now the second thief is the one who's sort of the center of this story, because suddenly, for some reason, in the midst of his own agony and pain, he gets it. He sees, first of all, that Jesus is innocent. He can just tell the whole thing. You can see it in the face of Jesus and in what's going on. He says, hey, shut up, will you? We're deserving of death. This guy, he's innocent. And then furthermore, having looked and seen Jesus, King of the Jews, he believes it. And he says, Jesus, would you remember me when you come into your kingdom? It's a wonderful thought. You know, Jesus, you seem to be so merciful. You just prayed, Father, forgive them. Sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze. And Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And what a gracious, if he's a king and such a merciful king, would you remember me when you get into your kingdom? Jesus says, today you'll join me in paradise. And even there on the cross, of course, Jesus reaches out in mercy. That's why it's such a wonderful story. I think last time I preached the gospel in Flushing, I used this story just because it's such a wonderful story of forgiveness and a new start. And here, once again, the Son of Man takes a companion with him into paradise. Jesus wants to be with men. He's saving all mankind to be with all mankind. He's the Son of Man, and as Son of Man, he belongs to a new race of man created through this salvation. And so he's bringing the first man into paradise, as it were, even as a first result of his dying on the cross. Wonderful thought, huh? And so once again, well, now this is kind of an unexpected witness, wouldn't you say? One of the thieves on the cross who protests of his innocence. As we said, Luke is showing by many proofs that this is true. All right, 44 through 46. Yeah.
It was now about the sixth hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the ninth hour. While they spent by the veil, and the curtain of the temple torn in two. Then Jesus, coming out looked around the place, saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he left his
All right. Of course, this is the end of it all. So let's see. Who can I ask? Loka, what is the sixth hour? And then it stayed dark till the ninth hour.
This is like probably 4 or 5 p.m.
Where's your KTZ watch? Don't you have a KTZ?
Albert's watch. So.
Oh, you got Elbert? Now, Elber's watch should have the time right on it. So it should say sixth hour is 12 noon. 12 noon to 3 p.m. This is the Roman scheme of things. Everybody got up at 6 a.m. So that's, first hour. All right. So 6 hours noon and things went dark. What does that speak to you? Jesus hanging on the cross, basically silence for 3 hours, except where he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. What does that mean? What's that? No. Good job. Yeah, right. The tip off on the Father into thy hands would be Abba, right? No, but it says it in Mark. He uses because Peter and the people who heard him say that remember the word in Aramaic, so they put into even the gospel record, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? This was something that, we have to remember, as first generation eyewitnesses, there were certain triggers that these people had for the rest of their lives. They'll always remember that. But anyway, so darkness fell upon the whole thing. And here's a wonderful, Luke makes it a little different. In Matthew and Mark, it says the veil is torn from the top to the bottom, but it actually says in the gospel, the veil rent in two, as if the veil did it itself. The veil rent in two, literally, as one writer put it, as if pent-up grace finally broke through. That veil was 1 foot thick. That's something you just go like a phone book. Well, Sammy probably could. No, maybe not.
No, they actually say, I think they say, so 200 people in hanging. 200. I mean, that was serious.
That's serious stuff.
Serious stuff.
Yeah. But the veil,
I couldn't rivet.
the veil rent right down from the top to the bottom. So something now. So of course, we think of this. Well, what do you think of that? When you hear that, what does that mean to you? Spiritually, symbolically, what does that mean to you? Now we can enter the Holy of Holies. But in the context of Luke, what would you say that meant? Darkness fell upon the earth at 3 hours. The veil was rent. That's it?
God's angry.
Well, this is a judgment upon the whole system of the temple. God's house had become a den of thieves. The very center of the place was torn, irreparably torn. God is having done with the whole system, as I think Luke would see it, okay? And then there was a shout. Now, right now I'm using, I like to try different translations. Right now I'm using this Holman Bible. Maybe you know about this translation? It's a pretty good translation, but see, it misses it all together. Actually, at this particular point, well, I don't like the fact that it says, and there he was crucified, and it says in there, and there they killed him. What was the word they used? They didn't even use the word crucified. I don't like that. Anyway, but the point is, before Jesus said, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit," which he didn't shout. Sorry. He gave out a great shout. And then in his last breath, he said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." What was the great shout he gave? You have to know another gospel to know a great shout. The penultimate of the 7 words of Jesus was, "It is finished." Telos! Boy, that must have scared some of the people down on the bottom. What does that mean? Telos! It's finished. Perfect. Done. And then this most beautiful prayer a human man could ever make: "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." That says so much. First of all, in my crazy preachments over the last few months, I've been trying to emphasize the fact that we are, in fact, spirit as people. Spirit, soul, body. And when Jesus is going out of this life, he commits to his Father the most real and deepest essence of who he was, his spirit. Soul, his body, his spirit he gives and commits to his Father in loving trust in this last great statement of faith. All right. Verses 47 through 49.
So when the centurion saw it having glorified God, saying, "Certainly this is a righteous man," and the whole crowd came together to that sight, seeing what he had done, gave him mercy in return. But all his acquaintances and the ones who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching.
Now, no other gospel writer adds in all of these people into this parade at the crucifixion of Jesus. All of these witnesses who witness and testify the reality is. And these could be some of the sources of Luke's writing, by the way. Many people think, since Luke is the only one who gives the occasion of Jesus appearing before Herod, that who was probably the person who gave him that source? Anybody know? Well, Ray, you got
No, John was in connection to Annas and Caiaphas.
yeah. Probably Joanna, who was Chuza's wife, and Chuza was an attendant of Herod. So Luke got so many resources and things, This is very wonderful, these things that he sees. Anyway, the veteran centurion, whose witness can be trustworthy, says, "The man is righteous." Another testimony of the innocence of Jesus and of what was going on. And then the railing crowd, as they railed and carried on with their mob cruelty, when they saw it was didn't pay off and Jesus died in silence, as it were, they beat their chests in bitter remorse. People often realize what wrong they've done after the deed is done. Mob psychology is a dangerous thing. You get people together in a mob, they'll do stuff that they'll all regret later on. And certainly it seems to be the case here. And then there's those wonderful Galilean women in the background. Not sure if who they're talking about, maybe even Mary. But anyway, those women who ministered to Jesus as they went place to place. So they were devoted women, and they stood far off. And why does Luke include them? As a testimony that Jesus really died on that cross, on the place of the skull. And later, they pop up a few verses later as witnesses of where he was buried as well. So it's important that Luke include this the historical aspects, and so that's what he's trying to do. All right. Now we come upon yet another witness in his own way of this story. Eli, you got a scripture? Julia, you can take it? Either way.
And the whole interest of a man named Joseph, counselor, was a good man and just. The same had not consented to the counsel and deal with him. He was of Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who also himself waited for the kingdom of God.
Okay. Now, these are historic, these are significant points, as minor as they may seem. So let's just look, first of all, at Joseph of Arimathea. Now, here is another thing that Luke brings in. Here are some people. When's the last time he mentioned about people waiting for the consolation of the coming kingdom? At the very beginning of the gospel, as he brings in Elizabeth and brings in these people who, who hear the good news of John the Baptist's birth and all that. Here's some God-fearers, Anna in the temple, all this kind of thing. And now here's another Jew, a rich Jewish man, on the council, which means on the Sanhedrin, and yet a godly man. And here he was serving in the Sanhedrin. I don't think the other Sanhedrin members thought he had any interest in Jesus at all, but he obviously declined and dissented in their opinion of what to do about Jesus. And of course, what do we find out from John? John spills the beans many years later on these things. Luke doesn't want to tell you this. He just wants you to see that a good, godly Jewish man had the faith, had the guts, was willing to go to Pilate directly. Listen, this is not an easy thing. Ask for Jesus' body. Wait a minute, what are you up to? Take it gently down from the cross. Go and buy some linen, as it tells us in Mark. He went and bought linen to wrap Jesus up, and he gently wrapped Jesus in the linen, put him in his own tomb in which no other man had been placed. Why would he say that? Because some might even say these bones or whatever are the remains of somebody else. You see, in the tombs, if you've been to the garden tomb, it's very much like the tombs of those ancient days. You usually had about the 4 different bunks for the, So after the burial thing was over, then they went back and they wrapped them up. And then when they went back 6 months later, when the body had totally rotted, and they took the bones and put them in these different bunks. So you usually had so you didn't have a dugout tomb cave that didn't have 5 or 6 bunks in it. And basically what this means is Joseph of Arimathea gave up his family tomb, because once you sealed it, it was never to be opened again. And Jesus alone, his body would be in it. So all of these things are just part of the record. But the wonderful witness again is Joseph of Arimathea. Now, of course, John reveals that Joseph is John says it, a secret disciple. There he is on the Sanhedrin. It's wonderful. So it's wonderful that God has secret disciples in the most unlikely places. On the other hand, one of the works of the cross is it brought the secret disciple out in the open. And now suddenly this guy, because you know what Jesus needed right then? A human friend who could take him down and bury him so he could rise again. Peter had no tomb. John, the disciples had run away. But here's a man for the hour. And he comes and does it. And of course, from John, we also learned that who else was in on the plan? Nick. Nick was there. And he is sort of a secret disciple. But, Jesus' death on the cross brings the secret disciples out in an act of faith and courage. This was a very courageous thing to do. Don't you think? Go to Pilate and say, please give me Jesus' body. I want to bury it before sundown. I mean, surely Pilate would have said, hey, check this guy out. Run a quick internet search on this. Google Joseph of Arithmetic. Anyway, okay, there we go. And so there's Jesus' friend caring for his body even after he dies. And then some faithful sisters. This is just a modern rendering of it, drawn probably by Giovanna Leandro. I'm not sure who, but true in spirit. Verses 54 to 56. Yeah, Adam.
That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near. And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after. And they observed the tomb, and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils. And they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment.
Okay. And so here's those dear sisters who once again loved Jesus so dearly that they were willing to go and anoint the body and do all of the physical preparations for dealing properly with the one that they loved. And but they got there just as the Sabbath evening was coming. They didn't have enough time to put on the oils and everything. So they set it aside and they waited through the Sabbath, the longest Sabbath ever has been. And then finally, on the first day of the week, they went down to the tomb and they never got to minister to Jesus' body. Joseph of Arimathea was there on time. And once again, this is noted because, just historically speaking, here's some other witnesses who knew exactly where Jesus was buried. They watched him. You notice carefully. They watched to see the place, and they determined to come there again after the Sabbath to do their work. So all of these people kind of gathered in as minor characters, you might say, into the redemption play, but just to show what kind of influence the Son of Man has upon all mankind. It brings out the hidden ones. It brings out the haters. It brings out the repentant thief. It brings out the strangest people at the strangest times to have a part in this whole redemption. Jesus indeed has come to seek and save all of us. All right. And we will next Monday study the last chapter, the happy chapter. It's just hard to study these things, except that Luke helps us by not going into such the detail that Matthew and Mark went into, John went into. But anyway, we see the historical fact presented clearly to Theophilus and to us. Anybody have any question? Ray.
You mentioned earlier about the Aramaic that's in the other Gospels. What do you think is the significance of, there's a couple times in the Gospels where the Aramaic is used.
Yeah.
Why those times are picked out and drawn out?
I think that we can't draw much other than the fact that they could just hear Jesus saying it in their mind. You know, it's interesting. So later on, so now Luke goes into the book of Acts, and you remember when Peter comes up into the region of Sharon, and what's her name? Tabitha dies, and Dorcas, and she'd done good works, and she had died. And remember, he stands over the body and says, Talitha Kumi, which is exactly what Jesus said over the girl who had died. And so it's like deja vu. Now the church is saying and doing the things that Jesus did during his earthly life. So I think that's part of it. But I think the main thing is, you remember that? You remember when he said to that little child, Tabitha Kumi, and she got up? So there's sometimes the Aramaic, they remember those things. Yeah. So I don't think we can write a special gospel with those 4 statements and make a thing out. Anybody else?
What the Lord is saying to one of the saints on the cross that today will be with me in paradise, was he referring to the literal paradise, like the one Lazarus was with Abraham, that kind of paradise, or it's just a comforting?
Yeah, no. I mean, he literally meant paradise. Yeah.
So that's one for it.
There's a lot of, I mean, obviously there's mystery in this. You all know about, there's heaven and there's paradise, there's Hades and there's hell. So like 4 compartments here. And when you look at the rich man and Lazarus, you see these things wonderfully pictured. But paradise is Abraham's bosom. Paradise is the place of rest where righteous souls go. And Jesus was taking this man to that oasis as we await a bodily resurrection, that oasis for the soul, rest, paradise, and mangoes.
Well, that concept is very well received by people.
Yeah. And of course, Jesus probably knew more about what he really meant spiritually, but this is as much as that man could grasp. This day they'll be with you in paradise. He didn't want to say, now you understand, I'm not talking about heaven yet because I haven't been raised yet, and we're not going up. But remember, Revelation chapter 14, when he just said, you'll be with me in paradise. So this Thursday and Friday passage in Luke 23 is Jesus' longest day, longest night. And this has also been my longest day. Longest night. Yeah, somehow it works out. You're up for 48 hours to get back home, and I can't sleep on planes. Who can sleep on planes here? Oh, look at this. Tian, you raised your hand. Actually admit it. Oh. Christian Chen. They say, okay, you hear ding, ding, which means we're really going to take off. And it's really, you hear ding, ding, and you hear Christian Chen goes off like a baby and sleeps. And I watch him get angrier and angrier as 12 hours goes to 14. Father, we thank you that we all come as a great sea of humanity before the cross. We acknowledge Jesus as the Son of Man, as the righteous one, as the innocent one who died for us. We see 3 crosses up on a hill. 2 had criminals, and 1 died for us. We're so thankful for this story. Make it real to our hearts. And also give us that kind of a desire to witness of the historicity of this whole thing as we deal with those friends and loved ones around us who don't really know the story. The more we see the details, the more we wonder at the great forgiveness and love and grace that Jesus bore throughout his whole life, even to the very end. Help us, Lord, who live by this same grace, to live in such a wondrous way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.